For the last 3 years, I have been researching Russia's influence in Latvia, what Russian speakers think, what are relations between Latvian and Russian communities here in Latvia. I've been listening to what Russians have to say. And this has always been at the background of my life. You see, my grandmother, Mārtiņš Hiršs, she was in charge of the State Language Agency, in charge of diversification after the end of Soviet occupation in the 90s. And her perspective was clear enough, and politics was always discussed at home. And she thought that Latvia has suffered injustice from the hands of Russians. Russians, they have no right to celebrate Victory Day over the Nazis in the Second World War. It was not a victory, it was occupation of Latvia. And there are many Latvians who would agree with my grandmother. But then I started my studies. I studied politics in University of Latvia, and Nils Muizhnieks and others there, they exposed me to a wide range of different ideas. Russians too were victims of the Soviet regime. They celebrate victory in the Second World War because their parents fought in it. They died in it. They feel some pride, and it's only natural. It's not that they celebrate occupation of Latvia. Even more, during my studies, I made my first Russian friend. Imagine this, I had lived in Latvia for 18 years, and I had never had a Russian friend, in a country where a third of the population speaks Russian. And this is normal in Latvia. There are Latvians who don't know any Russians, and vice versa. And with Arturs, we talked about politics quite a lot. We often didn't agree, but we were friends, and I valued his opinions. But up till that point, I had never heard what Russian had to say. I had only heard Latvian stereotypes about Russian community here. But now I was listening and hearing what he had to say, why he believes what he believes. And it is hard to do that. Judging others, it comes so easily. Because the more important an idea is for you, the more deeply rooted it is. When someone challenges your deeply rooted beliefs, well, things can get emotional because we perceive that core of our identity is under attack. And this is simply how human mind works. And in Latvia, we do have these two different worldviews that exist here. Different perspectives on history, politics, language, and other issues, where Russian and Latvian community doesn't really agree on. Even have totally opposed worldviews about. For example, in one of the focus groups we conducted, there were Russians discussing events of Second World War. And the idea that Red Army liberated Latvia, it came up very quickly. And this lady behind the screen, observing the focus group, she got emotional. They have no right to say this. Soviet army didn't liberate Latvia, they occupied Latvia. And there definitely are people like this in our society who get emotional when exposed to different set of beliefs. And of course, this applies not only to Latvians, but also Russians here. On the other hand, majority of our society can get along. For example, in interviews what showed up, there are a lot of mixed marriages between Latvians and Russians here in Latvia. And when married couple, when they visit their Russian side of family, well, they tend to agree with everything the Russian parents say. What do you think what happens when they visit their Latvian parents? Well, nothing really happens. They agree with everything their Latvian parents have to say about politics and history and other issues. And to some extent, this shows that our society is mature. We try to avoid conflict. We want to get along. But since Russia's aggression in Ukraine and Crimea, the attention of the world has shifted towards Baltic states and Latvia. Kremlin used Russian-speaking community in Ukraine to incite mass uprising. And media abroad, like here, BBC, well, they look at the map and they say that in Kazakhstan, there are a lot of Russians, in Estonia, a lot of Russians, but in Latvia, the most. 26% of our population are ethnic Russians. Even more, 37% speak Russian. Their mother tongue is Russian language. And BBC concludes that Latvia is potential next target for Russia, the weakest link in NATO alliance. Another example, here, Stratfor, American think tank, they look a bit deeper. They see that Ukraine wasn't homogeneous, neither is Latvia. But still, in the capital, Riga, half of the population are Russian speakers. In the eastern part of Latvia, Latgale, again, half speak Russian language, which makes these two regions vulnerable. Another example, this top American military journal, Per Concordium. Well, their argument is quite simple. Latgal region of Latvia has a lot of Russians. It's a separate ethnic group with their own language, and is the logical location for any Russian invasion. And for the last 3 years, there have been many stereotypes and exaggerations like this in New York Times and other major media that suggests that Russian speakers are homogenous and they are pro-Russia. But are things really that bad? How can they know this? And they cannot, because up to last year, there was no data on this. No polls, nothing. These articles simply assume that most or majority of Russians are pro-Russia. At best, they've sent a journalist here. He's interviewed 1 or 2 Russian radicals that we do have here in Latvia, and he assumes that all Russians think like this. And I would say such approach is even harmful, because if you assume that all Russians in countries of this region are pro-Russia, you give a big power that Russia has over the hearts and minds of these people. It allows Putin to punch above his weight. Even more, it is offensive to many Russians who live here. And these biases and stereotypes, they are harmful. Evidence based on science and data should guide our thinking on this, should guide our policies on complex issues that we do have here in Latvia. So over the last years, I have been conducting research on this. There have been 2 nationally representative surveys across all Latvia, one in Latgale. There have been focus groups, interviews. I've been trying to listen to what Russian speakers have to say. So in Latvia, 37% of our population are Russian speakers. So are they a homogeneous, unified group? Not at all. And let me illustrate. One of the stories Russian propaganda tells about Ukraine, Latvia, and well, everyone they don't like, is that they're fascists. And we tested in our polls if people agree to these stories Russia tells about Latvia and the world. And to this question, is restoration of fascism taking place in Latvia? It's not at all Russian speakers agree to this. It's only roughly half. But even if people agree to this story that fascism is on the rise, what showed in the interviews, there was this lady from Latgale, and she agrees, yeah, fascism is on the rise. We asked her, well, where do you see this in your life? And she says, I don't see it. I see it only in TV. This is something that happens in Riga. Thank God we don't have anything like this in Latgale. In another interview, there is another lady, also a Russian speaker, and she has relatives in Ukraine. But she doesn't believe her relatives, because relatives have been brainwashed by fascist junta in Kiev. She does believe Russian state television. So think about this for a moment. Television, mass media, has a major hold on our minds, our hearts and minds of people. If you consume one biased source of information for years, it's not that surprising that you will agree to this. So by now, some of you might think that, well, all Russians consume Russian media. They all agree what Russia says. But this is not the case. In Latvia, roughly half of Russian speakers consume media only in Russian language, both from Russia, Russian state-owned, but also local media in Russian. Because local media, well, the most popular ones, they very often copy the stories that Russian media publishes. And we used also other questions which tested support for these Russian narratives about Latvia. So, do you think that Russia should protect Russian speakers in Latvia? Do you support use of pro-Russia symbols, Russian flags, Georgian ribbons, and Victory Day celebrations, and many others? And overall, half of Russian speakers in Latvia, well, they live in this Russian media sphere of influence. They agree with Russia's stories about the world. And the idea is that it would be easier for Putin to tap into the minds of people who already agree with, well, stories he tells about the world. But it gets more complicated than this. How many Russian speakers feel belonging to Russia here in Latvia? Even less. It's a minority. In the polls, 28% of Russian speakers, they say that feel close ties to Russia. In interviews, there was this one story that came up. For example, when Russians, when they travel to Moscow or St. Petersburg, the Russians there, they say that you're not real Russians. You have these Baltic accents. You're different. So it's not that surprising that the Russian community in Latvia doesn't feel that close ties to Russia. Even more, most of people who feel belonging to Russia also feel belonging to Latvia. here in the green. Only a small minority, roughly 10%, they are alienated from Latvian state and feel belonging only to Latvia. For example, when Russians from Latvia, when they travel to Europe, after events in eastern Ukraine, they tend to say that they are Latvians. They don't want to be perceived as Russians when in Europe. But it gets even more complicated than this. Georgian Ribbon. Wow. I know that for some of you, this causes some strong emotions. For some, it might be patriotism towards Russia. For others, it might be fear, some negative emotions. And you remember what I told you about these deeply held beliefs that invoke fear, that challenges our core beliefs. And this is exactly that. But you must agree that for last years, the number of Russian flags and Georgian ribbons, it has gone down on our streets. And I've gone to the Victory Day celebration and I've asked people, so why haven't you put on your Georgian ribbon this year? And what people say, that after separatists put on the symbol on their clothing in eastern Ukraine, it has become a symbol of separatism. And they will not put it on anymore. So there can be people in Latvia who agree with what Russia does in its foreign policy, who might like Vladimir Putin, but they don't want to be perceived as separatists in Latvia. Even more, this is also possible. As you remember from 2 slides ago, there are Russians who feel belonging to Russia and who feel belonging to Latvia as well. Their identities are complex. This is not a unified, homogeneous group. But it gets even more complicated than this. These attitudes people tell in surveys, it does not mean in any way that behavior will follow. Well, let me illustrate. For example, when you tick a box in a survey which says, well, which asks, are you religious? And you say, yeah, I'm religious. It doesn't mean that you're going to go to church on Sundays. Attitude does not predict future behavior. And it applies also to Russians here. So we used essentially psychological tests which allow to probe, are people going to be socially and politically active in the future? And the results of these tests, well, they say that our society, well, is not ready to go out and protest. They don't believe that their actions will change much. They don't think that standing out from the crowd is something good. And this, well, we are not like Greeks, for example. During financial crisis in Greece, there were many uprisings, violent protests. While in Latvia, we had only one small violent protest in January 13 with few windows smashed. And this might be bad for democracy in Latvia. But in terms of security, it is a good thing. Favorable conditions for mass protests do not exist. Russian speakers are not a homogeneous, they're not unified group. The extent of Russia's influence should not be overestimated. But by now, some of you must be thinking that, well, he's trying to whitewash the whole situation. He's trying to downplay Russia's influence in Latvia. And no, there definitely are problems and vulnerabilities that we have. There is potential for polarization in Latvia. There are these two realities groups of our society live in. Half of Russian speakers don't consume any media in other language than Russian. They don't consume media in Latvian or English, so that they don't get exposed to Latvian or Western worldview. And this can be a source of tension. There are also real problems that exist here in Latvia. For example, in the eastern region, Latgal region, unemployment currently is 18%, 1/8. This is Great Depression level of unemployment. And even more, if there were no problems in Latvia, Russian propaganda doesn't need real things to work with. It can take camera, put it at the right angle, and show a small protest as a large pro-Russia uprising. At the same time, I want to emphasize that to address these complex problems that we do have here in Latvia, we should look at evidence, at what are the facts. It's easy to build our worldview on fear and anecdotal evidence, but it's hard to think, hard to look for data, hard to listen what people have to say. But it allows us and policymakers to see the real picture, to address the real issues, not perceived ones. We should base our views on data, facts, and evidence, not stereotypes and biases. And going back to interviews, when Latvians and Russians meet, they try to avoid these sensitive topics in their conversations. And to some extent, this shows that our society is mature. They want to avoid conflict and get along. However, the next step in overcoming divisions in our society is talking and listening. These are sensitive issues. These are emotional issues. But I would recommend that you do talk about them with your Russian friends if you're Latvian, and your Latvian friends if you're Russian. Not to argue, not to convince, not to enlighten, but to understand why they believe what they believe. To acknowledge that the other party has a valid set of beliefs for good reasons. And that would be a next step in bringing these divided communities back together.